The helicopter banked hard over the guided missile destroyer USS Resolute, and Tessa Rinaldi tightened her grip on the oceanographic equipment case between her knees. Salt spray misted through the open door as the aircraft descended toward the pitching deck, and she watched the Marines assembled below with expressions that ranged from indifference to open hostility. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. What she had not prepared for was the specific flavor of contempt that radiated from the broad-shouldered man standing at the front of the welcoming party, his jaw set like concrete, and his eyes, tracking her, descent the way a predator watches wounded prey. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you are watching from. Maybe you have family who serve in the Navy or Marines. The helicopter touched down and Tessa stepped onto the deck, her civilian clothes immediately marking her as an outsider in this world of uniforms and rigid hierarchy. She wore khaki cargo pants and a navy blue windbreaker with the logo of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution embroidered on the chest, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that the wind immediately began to destroy. She stood 5'4" and weighed perhaps 120 pounds, and everything about her appearance suggested a woman who spent her days behind computer screens analyzing water samples rather than operating in contested waters off the coast of Yemen. Gunnery Sergeant Wade Crenshaw stepped forward before anyone else could move, his boots striking the deck with the authority of a man who believed he owned every surface he walked upon. He looked at Tessa the way one might examine something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of a shoe, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular cadence of someone who expected his words to function as commands. "Welcome aboard," he said without warmth. "I am Gunnery Sergeant Crenshaw. You must be our babysitting assignment." Tessa extended her hand and watched him ignore it completely. She let the hand fall and forced a nervous smile onto her face, playing the role she had rehearsed for 3 weeks before this deployment. "Dr. Tessa Rinaldi," she said, "I appreciate the Navy allowing me to conduct my research during your operations. I will try to stay out of your way." Crenshaw snorted. "You will do more than try. My men are preparing for actual combat operations while you play with your little water samples. Stay in your quarters, stay off the deck, and stay the hell away from anything that matters. Are we clear?" "Perfectly clear," Tessa replied, letting her voice waver slightly. She clutched her equipment case tighter, the picture of academic discomfort in a military environment. Inside her chest, her heart beat with the steady rhythm of someone who had faced far worse than theatrical intimidation. She had completed basic underwater demolition training. She had survived Hell Week on 2 hours of sleep and hypothermic conditions that made this mild harassment feel like a gentle breeze. But Gunnery Sergeant Crenshaw did not need to know that. Nobody on this ship needed to know that except for 2 people, and one of them was watching from the bridge with binoculars pressed to his eyes. Captain Nathaniel Okonkwo lowered the binoculars and allowed himself a small frown. He had known this would be difficult, placing one of the most decorated operators in naval special warfare aboard his vessel under civilian cover. But watching Crenshaw posture and threaten tested his patience in ways he had not anticipated. He reminded himself that Lieutenant Commander Rinaldi had volunteered for this assignment, had specifically requested it after intelligence identified the opportunity to intercept Viktor Semenov and his cargo of biological weapons. She knew the risks. She knew the isolation. She knew that maintaining her cover meant accepting treatment that would make lesser warriors break character and demonstrate exactly who they were dealing with. The captain turned from the window and found Lieutenant Felix Quigley waiting with a tablet, displaying the latest intelligence updates. Quigley was young for his position, barely 30, but his mind worked like a precision instrument designed specifically for processing threat assessments and operational parameters. "She is aboard," Okonkwo said simply. Quigley nodded. "Crenshaw is already establishing dominance. Should we intervene?" "Negative. She needs to be invisible. The moment anyone suspects she is more than a civilian researcher, this entire operation collapses. Semenov has sources everywhere. If word reaches him that a SEAL is operating in these waters, he will abort the transfer and we lose our only chance to recover the weapons manifest. Below deck, Tessa followed a young sailor through narrow corridors that smelled of diesel fuel and industrial cleaning solution. Her quarters were exactly what she had expected. A converted storage compartment barely large enough for a cot and her equipment cases. The sailor apologized for the accommodations with genuine embarrassment, explaining that the ship was not designed to house civilian researchers and this was the best they could manage on short notice. Tessa thanked him warmly and meant it. She had slept in far worse conditions during deployments that this young man would never hear about. When the door closed behind her, Tessa allowed her mask to slip for exactly 3 seconds. She stood motionless, breathing slowly, letting the tension drain from her shoulders while her mind cataloged every detail of the ship she had observed during her short journey from the flight deck. 14 Marines visible, plus the standard crew complement of approximately 300. Crenshaw commanded the Marine detachment, which meant he controlled the armed presence aboard the vessel. Captain Okonkwo commanded overall, but naval hierarchy meant that Marines often operated with considerable autonomy in matters they deemed their own concern. She would be very much their concern, she knew. A civilian woman on a combat vessel, taking up space and resources while warriors prepared for operations she supposedly knew nothing about. Every instinct they possessed would drive them to reject her presence, to test her, to push until she either broke or left. That was exactly what Tessa was counting on. The more they focused on harassing the helpless researcher, the less attention they would pay to what she was actually doing aboard the Resolute. Tessa opened her largest equipment case and ran her fingers over the oceanographic instruments nestled in protective foam. Beneath the instruments, accessible only through a hidden panel, waited the gear that defined who she truly was. The rebreather that would allow her to operate underwater for hours without surfacing. The compact propulsion device that could cover miles of open ocean. The combat knife her father had given her before his final voyage. The blade he said would always bring her home, even when the sea tried to keep her. She closed the case and sat on her cot, listening to the ship groan around her as it cut through swells that would have sent most civilians running for medication. The motion felt natural to her, almost comforting. She had grown up on boats, on the waters off Gloucester, where her family had fished for 3 generations. The ocean was not her enemy. It never had been, not even when it took her father during that nor'easter 15 years ago. The ocean was her element. And soon enough, Gunnery Sergeant Crenshaw and everyone else aboard the USS Resolute would understand exactly what that meant. The hazing began within hours of her arrival and escalated with methodical precision. Tessa returned to her quarters after her first meal in the mess hall to find her cot overturned and her civilian clothes scattered across the deck. Someone had taken a marker to her pillow, scrawling words that would have earned an immediate court-martial if any officer had witnessed them. She cleaned the mess without complaint, filed no report, and appeared at breakfast the next morning with the same nervous smile she had worn since stepping off the helicopter. Corporal Denny Holt became her shadow. Crenshaw had assigned the young Marine to monitor her movements, and Holt took to the task with the enthusiasm of someone desperate to prove his loyalty to a man he clearly worshipped. He was 26 years old with the build of someone who spent every free moment in the ship's gym, and he followed Tessa through the corridors with the subtlety of a freight train. When she set up her oceanographic equipment on the deck to collect water samples, Holt stood 3 feet away and watched her with unconcealed suspicion. When she retreated to her quarters to analyze the samples, he positioned himself outside her door and reported her every movement through his radio. Tessa allowed herself to be watched. She collected samples and ran analyses and documented everything with the meticulous attention to detail that her cover required. She also used every moment of apparent scientific work to study the ship, its crew, and the patterns of movement that would matter when the time came to act. She noted which hatches were guarded and which were forgotten. She memorized the watch rotation schedule by observing which faces appeared at which stations throughout the day. She identified the maintenance corridors that ran beneath the main decks, the ones that sailors used to move equipment but rarely patrolled. On the third day, her equipment began to malfunction. She opened her primary analysis kit to find salt water pooled in the bottom, her calibration instruments ruined beyond repair. The damage was too precise to be accidental. Someone had deliberately sabotaged her work, and the message was clear. You do not belong here. Leave before something worse happens. Tessa reported the damage to the quartermaster with appropriate distress, requesting replacement equipment that she knew would take weeks to arrive. The quartermaster, a weathered chief petty officer named Dominguez, looked at her ruined instruments with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what had happened but lacked the authority or inclination to investigate. He filed the requisition and told her he was sorry for the inconvenience, his voice carrying the tired resignation of someone who had seen this kind of thing before and knew that speaking up only made it worse. That night, Tessa lay on her cot and allowed her mind to drift back to a different time and a different form of torment. She remembered the pool at the Naval Special Warfare Center, the instructors who bound her hands and feet and threw her into water that seemed determined to claim her lungs. She remembered the panic that every candidate felt in those first moments, the primal terror of drowning that separated those who would become SEALs from those who would wash out. She remembered forcing that panic down into a dark corner of her mind and replacing it with something colder and harder. She remembered learning to love the water instead of fear it, to move through it like she belonged there, to understand that the ocean was not her enemy, but her ally. The harassment aboard the Resolute was nothing compared to that. Marker on a pillow was nothing compared to instructors who held your head underwater until your vision went black. Sabotaged equipment was nothing compared to surf torture in 50-degree water while your classmates collapsed around you and the instructor screamed that you would never be good enough. Tessa had survived all of it. She had graduated at the top of her class. She had deployed to places that did not exist on any official map and done things that would never appear in any report. Gunnery Sergeant Crenshaw thought he was breaking her. He had no idea that he was facing someone who had already been broken and rebuilt into something unbreakable. The fourth day brought a new escalation. Tessa entered the mess hall to find her usual seat occupied by Holt and two other Marines who watched her approach with predatory anticipation. She moved to another table and sat down with her tray, only to have Holt appear beside her within seconds. He planted both hands on the table and leaned close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "This seat is reserved," he said loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Tessa looked around the nearly empty mess hall with performed confusion. "Reserved for whom?" she asked. "For anyone who actually belongs on this ship," Holt replied, "which does not include civilians who cannot tell the difference between a destroyer and a fishing boat." Laughter rippled through the Marines at nearby tables. Tessa gathered her tray and stood, mumbling an apology that made Holt's smirk widen into a full grin. She ate her meal, standing in the corridor outside the galley, her back against a bulkhead and her eyes fixed on the deck plating beneath her feet. Anyone watching would have seen a woman thoroughly humiliated and close to breaking. What they could not see was the cold calculation running beneath her downcast expression, the way she was cataloging every face that had laughed and every Marine who had looked away. Among those who looked away was Lance Corporal Yuki Brennan, the only female Marine in Crenshaw's detachment. Brennan was 24 years old with a face that might have been carved from stone, expressionless and still as she watched Tessa's exile from the mess hall. Something flickered in her eyes as the civilian woman retreated, something that might have been recognition or guilt or the memory of similar treatment in her own past. But Brennan said nothing and did nothing, and when Holt returned to the table with his prize, she simply continued eating as if nothing had happened. Master Chief Petty Officer Augusto Reyes observed all of this from his position near the galley entrance. He was 45 years old with 30 years of naval service behind him, and he had seen enough operators in his career to recognize when someone was not what they appeared to be. The civilian researcher moved too well. She absorbed harassment with too much control. Her eyes tracked too many details, even when she was supposedly cowering. Reyes had served alongside SEALs during his years as a rescue swimmer. And something about this woman reminded him of the quiet ones, the operators who never raised their voices because they never needed to. He made no accusations and asked no questions. He simply watched and waited, trusting that whatever was really happening aboard the Resolute would reveal itself in time. The ocean always gave up her secrets eventually. You just had to be patient enough to let her. The communication center was located deep within the ship, behind a door that required both a key card and a 6-digit code to access. Tessa waited until 0300 hours, when a night watch was at its thinnest and the corridors were empty of everyone except essential personnel. She moved through the ship like smoke, her footsteps silent on the deck plating, her body instinctively finding the shadows that would hide her passage from any chance observer. Lieutenant Felix Quigley was waiting for her inside, his face illuminated by the green glow of multiple monitors displaying satellite imagery and intelligence reports. He looked up as she entered and gestured toward a chair beside his workstation, his expression carrying the tension of someone who understood exactly how much was riding on the next 72 hours. Semenov's submarine will surface at these coordinates, Quigley said, pointing to a spot on the digital map that showed open water approximately 40 miles from their current position. Our intelligence indicates he will transfer the biological agents to a fishing vessel crewed by Yemeni militants. The transfer window is approximately 90 minutes. After that, the submarine disappears and we lose our only chance to recover the weapons manifest. Tessa studied the coordinates and calculated distances in her head. 40 miles was nothing for the Resolute, but the ship could not approach without alerting Semenov's surveillance network. The arms dealer had sources everywhere, including assets within multiple naval intelligence agencies. Any deviation from the destroyer's scheduled patrol route would trigger alarms that would send the submarine diving before Tessa could get anywhere near it. I will need to deploy at least 6 hours before the transfer window, she said. That gives me time to reach the intercept point and establish a position before Semenov surfaces. Quigley nodded and pulled up another display showing the submarine's technical specifications. Viktor Semenov had purchased the vessel from a cash-strapped former Soviet republic 15 years ago and had spent a fortune upgrading its stealth capabilities. The submarine could run silent at depths that would crush conventional vessels, and its crew was composed of former Russian naval personnel who had traded their loyalty for salaries that dwarfed anything their government had ever paid them. The manifest is everything, Quigley continued. Semenov has been selling biological agents to terrorist organizations for almost a decade, but we have never been able to prove the scope of his network. That manifest contains buyer information, delivery schedules, and payment records. If you can recover it, we can dismantle his entire operation and identify every group that has purchased weapons from him. And Semenov himself? Tessa asked. Quigley's expression hardened. The authorization is clear. Viktor Semenov does not leave that submarine alive. He has killed too many people with the weapons he has sold. This ends with him. Tessa absorbed this without visible reaction. She had killed before, in circumstances that range from desperate firefights to cold and calculated eliminations. The weight of those deaths lived somewhere deep inside her, in a place she visited only in her quietest moments. She did not enjoy killing. She did not seek it out. But she understood that some people forfeited their right to continue breathing when they chose to profit from the deaths of innocents. And Viktor Semenov had forfeited that right many times over. She turned her attention to the personal file Quigley had assembled on the arms dealer. Semenov was 53 years old, a former Soviet intelligence officer who had recognized the opportunities presented by the collapse of his country and had pivoted from serving the state to serving himself. He had started by selling surplus weapons from abandoned military bases, then graduated to increasingly sophisticated and dangerous merchandise. The biological agents he was now trafficking represented the pinnacle of his career, weapons capable of killing thousands with a single deployment. The file also contained information about Semenov's security protocols. He was paranoid to the point of pathology, never sleeping in the same location twice, never meeting contacts in person unless absolutely necessary, never trusting anyone who had not proven their loyalty through years of service. The submarine transfer was one of the rare occasions when he exposed himself to potential attack, and even then he surrounded himself with guards who would die before allowing anyone to reach him. Tessa memorized every detail and then asked Quigley to delete the files from the system. The less evidence of this briefing that existed, the better. If something went wrong and she was captured or killed, there could be no trail leading back to the Resolute or the officers who had authorized her mission. Quigley hesitated before complying. There was something he wanted to say, something personal that pressed against the professional boundaries they had maintained throughout their planning sessions. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "My sister was in Nairobi," he said. "The embassy bombing in '98. She survived, but she lost both legs and spent 3 years learning to walk again. The group that planted that bomb bought their explosives from a network that Semenov helped establish. He did not build the bomb or plant it, but he made it possible. He made all of it possible." Tessa met his eyes and saw the pain that lived there, the old wound that had never fully healed. She understood why Quigley had volunteered for this assignment, why he had spent months building the intelligence picture that made this operation possible. This was personal for him in a way that transcended duty or patriotism. "I will not fail," she said simply. Quigley nodded and turned back to his monitors, the moment of vulnerability already retreating behind his professional mask. Tessa slipped out of the communication center and made her way back through the sleeping ship, her mind processing everything she had learned while her body moved on autopilot through the familiar corridors. She thought about her father as she walked, the way she often did when preparing for dangerous operations. Sal Rinaldi had been a fisherman who understood the ocean better than anyone she had ever known, a man who could read the weather and the color of the sky and predict where the fish would run based on currents that were invisible to everyone else. He had taught her to respect the water, to work with it rather than against it, to understand that the sea was not cruel or kind, but simply indifferent to human concerns. He had also taught her that some things were worth risking everything for. Protecting people who could not protect themselves. Standing up to those who preyed on the weak. Doing the right thing, even when the right thing was hard and dangerous and might cost you everything you had. Tessa reached her quarters and sealed the door behind her. In 36 hours, she would slip into the ocean and swim toward a confrontation that would either end Viktor Semenov's reign of death or end her own life. She was ready for both possibilities. She had been ready since the day she watched her father's empty boat drift back to Gloucester without him. Since the day she decided that the water would never take anyone else she loved. The ocean had made her who she was. Now she would use everything it had taught her to stop a monster. The sea turned angry on the 6th day. Swells that had been manageable doubled in size as a storm system moved through the region, and the Resolute pitched and rolled with enough force to send unsecured equipment sliding across decks. Most of the crew adapted with the practiced ease of experienced sailors, but the conditions made movement through the ship treacherous for anyone not accustomed to finding their footing on a surface that refused to stay level. Tessa used the chaos to her advantage. She made her way to the observation deck, where her remaining oceanographic equipment was secured, ostensibly to check that the storm had not damaged her sensors. In reality, she wanted to study the water conditions and calculate how they would affect her approach to the intercept coordinates. Heavy swells would make the swim more exhausting, but would also provide cover, breaking up her silhouette and masking any sound she might make during her approach. She was adjusting a sensor mount when the alarm sounded. "Man overboard," the speaker system crackled. "All hands, man overboard, port side aft." Tessa moved before conscious thought caught up with instinct. She reached the port rail in seconds, her eyes scanning the churning gray water for any sign of the fallen sailor. The swells were running 8 to 10 feet, high enough to swallow a person whole between crests, and the water temperature was cold enough to induce hypothermia within an hour of exposure. She spotted him 50 yards from the ship and drifting fast, a young sailor whose arms were flailing in the panic of someone who had never trained for this kind of emergency. His life vest had inflated, but he was fighting it instead of relaxing into the buoyancy, wasting energy he would desperately need if rescue took more than a few minutes. The rescue team was mobilizing behind her, sailors scrambling to deploy the recovery boat, while others prepared lines and flotation devices. Tessa calculated distances and current speed and realized with cold certainty that the boat would not reach him in time. The current was pulling him away from the ship faster than the crew could respond, and every second that passed pushed him further into water that wanted to kill him. She gripped the rail and felt her body tense with the urge to act. She could reach him. She knew she could. The distance was nothing, the water temperature was manageable, and she had trained for exactly this kind of rescue more times than she could count. But diving into the ocean would raise questions she could not answer. A civilian researcher with no military training should not be capable of a combat swimmer rescue in conditions that would challenge even experienced sailors. Master Chief Reyes appeared beside her, his eyes fixed on the struggling sailor in the water. He held a pair of binoculars, but was not using them, his gaze calculating the same variables Tessa had already processed. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "Current is pulling him southeast at about 3 knots, he said. "Recovery boat will not reach him for at least 4 minutes. Water temperature is 63 degrees. He has maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia sets in, less if he keeps thrashing like that." Tessa said nothing, but her hands tightened on the rail until her knuckles went white. Reyes glanced at her, and something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. He turned back to the water and continued speaking in that same quiet voice. "I was a rescue swimmer for 12 years, he said. "I know what a person looks like when they're deciding whether to go in. I also know that some people have reasons for staying on deck, even when everything inside them is screaming to jump." The recovery boat finally launched, fighting through the swells toward the drifting sailor. Tessa watched with her heart pounding against her ribs, counting seconds and calculating odds. The boat reached him with perhaps 2 minutes to spare, the crew hauling his shivering body over the gunwale and wrapping him in thermal blankets. He would survive. He would probably not even remember how close he had come to dying in water that did not care whether he lived or drowned. Tessa released the rail and stepped back, her mask of civilian helplessness settling back into place. She turned to find Reyes watching her with an expression that contained no accusation, only quiet acknowledgement. "You move like water," he said. "I noticed it the first day you came aboard. Most civilians fight the motion of a ship. You flow with it like you were born on a deck." Tessa forced a small laugh that she hoped sounded nervous. "My father was a fisherman. I grew up on boats." Reyes nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "That must be it," he agreed. "Just a fisherman's daughter who happens to calculate rescue swimmer approach vectors in her head while watching a man drown." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Tessa alone at the rail with the storm howling around her and the certain knowledge that her cover was not as solid as she had believed. She found Crenshaw waiting for her when she returned to the interior corridors. His face was flushed with an anger that seemed disconnected from any immediate cause, and Holt stood behind him with arms crossed and eyes eager for confrontation. "Where were you during the emergency?" Crenshaw demanded. "Civilians are supposed to remain in their quarters during man-overboard situations. You could have gotten in the way of rescue operations." "I wanted to help," Tessa replied, letting her voice quaver. "I thought maybe there was something I could do." Crenshaw stepped closer, using his height to loom over her in a display of physical intimidation that would have been laughable if it were not so calculated. "You want to help," he said. "You want to contribute to this ship. Then stay in your hole and stop pretending you belong anywhere near actual sailors doing actual work. The next time you interfere with operations, I will have you confined to quarters for the remainder of this deployment." Tessa nodded and mumbled an apology, her eyes fixed on the deck. Crenshaw snorted with satisfaction and pushed past her, Holt following with a smirk that promised future harassment. She waited until their footsteps faded before raising her head, her expression shifting from frightened civilian to something far colder and more calculating. Reyes had seen through her act. That was a problem, but not an insurmountable one. The Master Chief had chosen not to expose her, which meant he either supported whatever she was really doing aboard the Resolute or was waiting to see how events unfolded before taking action. Either way, she would need to be more careful. The mission was too important to compromise because she could not fully suppress the instincts that years of training had burned into her bones. 24 hours remained before she would slip into the ocean and become the weapon she had always been. Until then, she would endure whatever Crenshaw and his men chose to inflict upon her. She would absorb their hatred and their contempt and their pathetic displays of dominance. And when the time came, she would show them exactly what they had been trying to destroy. The Resolute entered the operational zone at 1400 hours, and the atmosphere aboard the ship changed immediately. Communications were restricted to essential traffic only. The crew moved with a tension that suggested everyone understood something significant was happening, even if most of them did not know the details. Marines checked their weapons with increased frequency, and the officers gathered in briefing rooms that remained locked to all but those with the highest clearances. Tessa felt the change like a shift in barometric pressure, a tightening of the air itself that signaled approaching storms. She maintained her routine of collecting water samples and running analyses, playing the role of oblivious civilian while the ship prepared for an operation she was not supposed to know anything about. Her equipment cases remained in her quarters, the hidden compartments still sealed, the gear inside waiting for the moment when she would stop pretending and start acting. Crenshaw's behavior grew more erratic as the hours passed. He paced the corridors with a restless energy that bordered on paranoia, stopping crew members to demand status reports and snapping at anyone who failed to meet his exacting standards. Something about the increased operational tempo had triggered a response in him that went beyond normal mission preparation. He was hunting for something, Tessa realized. He was looking for a threat that he could not quite identify, but sensed was lurking somewhere aboard his ship. She was working at her makeshift laboratory station when he found her quarters unattended. She had left deliberately, giving him the opportunity she knew he was seeking. Hidden cameras she had placed during her first night aboard captured everything. Crenshaw entering without authorization, searching through her personal effects, opening her equipment cases, and examining the contents with growing frustration. He found the oceanographic instruments and the replacement sensors that had arrived to replace the ones his men had sabotaged. He found civilian clothing and research notebooks filled with data about water temperatures and salinity levels. He found nothing that should have alarmed him, nothing that revealed the truth about who she was or why she was really aboard the Resolute. But the equipment cases were heavy, too heavy for the instruments they supposedly contained. Crenshaw lifted one and felt the weight distribution shift in ways that suggested hidden compartments, concealed spaces that held something other than scientific gear. He did not open the false panels. Perhaps he lacked the knowledge to find them, or perhaps some instinct warned him that discovering what lay beneath would force him to take actions he was not prepared to take. Instead, he replaced the case exactly where he had found it, and left her quarters with an expression of grim certainty on his face. Tessa reviewed the footage from her hiding spot in a maintenance corridor and understood that the situation had escalated beyond simple harassment. Crenshaw was no longer content to bully and intimidate. He had convinced himself that she represented a genuine threat to his ship and his men, and he would act on that conviction with the same aggressive certainty that defined everything he did. She needed to accelerate her timeline. The intercept was still 18 hours away, but remaining aboard the Resolute until then had become too dangerous. If Crenshaw reported his suspicions to Captain Okonkwo, the captain would be forced to respond in ways that could compromise the entire operation. Better to disappear now and let everyone assume she had simply left, overwhelmed by the harassment and eager to escape. But disappearing required accessing her gear, and accessing her gear required returning to quarters that Crenshaw was almost certainly watching. The solution came from an unexpected source. Master Chief Reyes found her in the mess hall during the evening meal. Sliding into the seat across from her with a tray of food he seemed to have no intention of eating. He said nothing for a long moment, simply studying her face with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by surface appearances. "Crenshaw searched your quarters this afternoon," he said finally. His voice was pitched low enough that no one at nearby tables could hear. "He thinks you're a spy or a journalist or something else that threatens his command. He is not wrong that you are something other than what you appear, but he has no idea what he is actually dealing with." Tessa maintained her civilian mask, even as her mind raced through possible responses. "I do not know what you mean," she said. "I am just a researcher trying to complete my work." Reyes shook his head slowly. "I spent 12 years pulling people out of water that was trying to kill them. I know what a trained swimmer looks like, how they move, how they breathe, how they calculate currents and temperatures without conscious thought. You did all of that during the man overboard yesterday. You did it automatically, the same way I would have done it." He leaned closer, his voice dropping even further. "I also spent 4 years attached to SEAL team operations as a rescue swimmer support asset. I know what operators look like when they are undercover. You are good, better than most, but you cannot hide what you are from someone who has seen it before." Tessa held his gaze and made a decision. She could not afford to maintain the pretense with someone who had already seen through it, not when doing so might cost her the mission. She let the mask slip, just slightly, allowing the steel beneath to show through. "What do you want?" she asked. Reyes smiled, a small expression that contained no humor. "I want to help. Whatever you're doing aboard this ship, it is more important than Crenshaw's ego or my curiosity. I can create a distraction that will draw him away from your quarters for exactly 15 minutes. What you do with that time is your business." "Why would you help me?" Tessa asked. "You do not know what I am planning. You do not know if I am a threat to this ship." "Because I have served alongside enough SEALs to recognize one," Reyes replied. "And because whatever you are planning, it is sanctioned by someone with enough authority to put you on this ship under civilian cover. That means it matters. That means lives depend on it." He stood and picked up his untouched tray. 15 minutes, he repeated, starting at 2200 hours. "Do not waste them." Tessa watched him walk away and felt something she had not expected to feel during this mission: gratitude. She had been prepared to operate entirely alone, to trust no one and rely on nothing but her own training and determination. Reyes had offered her something more valuable than he could possibly understand. He had offered her an ally in a place where she had assumed she had only enemies. At 2200 hours exactly, a fire alarm sounded in the marine berthing compartment. Crenshaw and his men rushed to respond to what appeared to be an electrical malfunction in the ventilation system. Tessa moved through the empty corridors like a ghost, reached her quarters in under 2 minutes, and began extracting her gear from the hidden compartments. The mission was still 18 hours away, but when the time came, she would be ready. The storm that had been building all day finally broke at 2300 hours. Rain lashed the deck in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind howled through the superstructure with a fury that seemed almost personal. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, illuminating the churning ocean in frozen moments of terrible clarity before plunging everything back into darkness. Tessa had returned her gear to its hiding place after the distraction Reyes had provided, knowing that she could not risk keeping it accessible while Crenshaw remained suspicious. She planned to retrieve it again in the early morning hours, slip over the side before dawn, and begin her approach to the intercept coordinates. The storm would provide cover for her departure, masking the sound of her entry into the water and making visual detection nearly impossible. But Crenshaw had other plans. She was making her way back to her quarters when she heard the footsteps behind her. Heavy boots on metal decking, multiple sets moving with purpose and coordination. She quickened her pace, but did not run, maintaining the illusion of a frightened civilian even as her combat instincts screamed warnings that she forced herself to ignore. They caught her at the hatch leading to the fantail, the open deck at the stern of the ship where the storm raged with unobstructed violence. Holt grabbed her arm and spun her around, his grip hard enough to leave bruises. Behind him stood Crenshaw and 3 other Marines, their faces set with the grim determination of men who had convinced themselves they were doing something righteous. Going somewhere Crenshaw asked. His voice cut through the howling wind with the precision of a blade. Tessa let fear flood her expression, widening her eyes and allowing her body to tremble in Holt's grip. "I was just returning to my quarters," she said. "Please, you are hurting me." Crenshaw stepped closer, rain streaming down his face and dripping from the brim of his cover. "I searched your quarters today. Your equipment is too heavy for scientific instruments. You are hiding something, and I intend to find out what." "I do not understand," Tessa stammered. "My equipment is standard oceanographic gear. If it seems heavy, it is because of the protective casings required for sensitive electronics." Crenshaw shook his head slowly, water flying from the motion. "I have been in the military for 15 years. I know when someone is lying to me. You are not a researcher. You are not even a civilian. I do not know what you are, but I know you do not belong on my ship." He gestured to Holt, who began dragging Tessa toward the fantail hatch. She struggled against his grip with exactly the amount of resistance a terrified civilian woman would offer, enough to seem genuine, but not enough to break free. The hatch opened, and the storm roared through the gap, rain and wind slamming into them with physical force. The fantail was a nightmare of churning water and howling darkness. Waves crashed against the hull 40 feet below, sending spray high enough to drench anyone standing at the rail. Lightning flickered constantly now, turning the scene into a strobe-lit vision of chaos and danger. No sane person would choose to be on this deck in these conditions. That was precisely why Crenshaw had chosen it. Tessa felt the rail press against her back as Holt shoved her against it. The other Marines formed a semicircle around her, blocking any escape route. Crenshaw stood at the center, his expression visible in the lightning flashes as something between righteous anger and cold satisfaction. "I'm giving you one chance," he said. "Tell me who you really are and why you are on this ship. Tell me the truth, and I will simply have you confined until we reach port. Lie to me again, and accidents happen at sea, especially during storms like this." Tessa calculated her options with the cold precision that years of training had instilled in her. She could fight. She could disable Holt in under 2 seconds and neutralize at least 2 more of the Marines before they understood what was happening. She could probably take all 5 of them, even in these conditions, even with the deck pitching beneath her feet and the rain obscuring her vision. But fighting would intermission. It would reveal exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Captain Okonkwo would be forced to explain her presence, and the entire operation would unravel. Viktor Semenov would disappear with his cargo of biological weapons, free to continue selling death to anyone with enough money to pay for it. She made her choice in the space between heartbeats. "I am just a researcher," she said, letting her voice break with convincing desperation. "Please, I do not know what you want me to say. I'm not a spy. I'm not a threat. I just want to go home." Crenshaw stared at her for a long moment, rain streaming down his face, lightning illuminating the contempt in his eyes. Then he nodded to Holt. The push came fast and hard, both hands slamming into her chest with enough force to lift her off her feet. Tessa felt the rail catch her at the small of her back, felt her center of gravity shift past the point of no return, felt the terrible certainty of falling seize her body as she tumbled backward into darkness. She hit the water 40 feet below with an impact that drove the breath from her lungs. The cold seized her immediately, shocking her system with temperatures that would kill an untrained person within hours. The current grabbed her and began pulling her away from the ship, away from the lights that were already fading in the storm-torn darkness. Above her, standing at the rail he had just pushed her over, Corporal Denny Holt watched the churning water swallow any trace of the woman he had just murdered. Beside him, Gunnery Sergeant Crenshaw was already turning away. "If anyone asks, she was never on deck tonight," Crenshaw said. "She was confined to quarters and must have wandered out during the storm. Tragique accident. These things happen." The Marines filed back through the hatch, leaving the fantail empty except for the rain and the wind and the waves that continued to crash against the hull of the ship that was now carrying them toward an operation none of them truly understood. 40 feet below and drifting fast, Tessa Rinaldi forced the shock from her body and began to swim. The ocean tried to kill her in the first 30 seconds. A wave crashed over her head and drove her beneath the surface, spinning her in a disorienting tumble that stripped away any sense of direction. Salt water flooded her mouth and nose, burning her sinuses and threatening to trigger the panic response that had ended the careers of countless SEAL candidates during training. Tessa did not panic. She had been here before, in waters colder and more violent than this, with instructors standing by to let her drown if she could not find the discipline to save herself. She relaxed into the chaos, letting the wave spend its energy against her limp body, waiting for the moment when the water released its grip and allowed her to surface. Her head broke free and she gasped air, immediately orienting herself by the fading lights of the Resolute. The ship was already 200 yards away and pulling further with every passing second. The current was stronger than she had calculated, running southeast at nearly 4 knots and carrying her into open ocean with relentless efficiency. She had 2 choices. She could fight the current and try to reach the ship, exhausting herself in a battle she would almost certainly lose. Or she could surrender to the water and let it carry her while she conserved her strength for what lay ahead. C'est sa chose surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of strategy. She rolled onto her back and floated, letting the waves lift and drop her while she controlled her breathing and assessed her condition. Her civilian clothes were weighing her down, so she stripped them off piece by piece, kicking away her shoes and pants until she wore only her underwear and the thin thermal undershirt she had worn beneath her windbreaker. The cold was already seeping into her muscles, slowing her movements and clouding her thoughts. Hypothermia would begin setting in within the hour if she could not find a way to generate heat through movement. But moving too much would exhaust her energy reserves and leave her helpless when she needed strength most. It was a delicate balance, the kind that separated those who survived the ocean from those who became its victims. She thought about her father as she drifted. Sal Rinaldi had taught her to respect the sea, but never to fear it. Fear makes you fight, he had told her during one of their fishing trips, and fighting the ocean is like fighting the sky. You cannot win, so you should not try. Work with the water, not against it. Let it show you where it wants you to go, and then find a way to make that work for you. The current was pulling her southeast. The intercept coordinates where Semenov's submarine would surface lay approximately 8 miles to the east. If she angled her swimming correctly, she could use the current to carry her most of the distance while expending minimal energy on course corrections. She began to swim, not the frantic thrashing of a drowning victim, but the smooth and efficient stroke of someone who had spent thousands of hours training in water. Her arms cut through the waves with practiced precision. Her legs kicked in a rhythm that maximized propulsion while minimizing effort. Each breath was timed to the motion of the swells, inhaling at the crest and exhaling as she descended into the trough. The storm raged around her, but she moved through it like a creature born to this element. Lightning illuminated her path in frozen moments of clarity, showing her the endless expanse of churning water that surrounded her on all sides. Thunder rolled across the sky like the voice of an angry god, but Tessa heard only the rhythm of her own breathing and the steady beat of her heart. Hours passed. The storm began to weaken as she swam, the wind dying from howl to a whisper, the waves settling from mountains to gentle rollers. The rain stopped and the clouds parted, revealing stars that glittered like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Tessa navigated by those stars, using constellations her father had taught her to identify when she was barely old enough to walk. The cold had sunk deep into her bones by now, a numbing presence that made every movement feel like pushing through concrete. Her muscles screamed for rest, for warmth, for the simple mercy of stopping. But stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing. And Tessa Rinaldi had not survived Hell Week in combat deployments and an attempted murder just to give up in the middle of an ocean she had been training to conquer her entire life. She kept swimming. Dawn began to lighten the horizon ahead of her, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the violence of the night. Tessa lifted her head and saw something that made her heart surge with renewed determination. Rocky outcroppings rising from the water perhaps half a mile ahead. The same formation she had identified in the intelligence briefings as the optimal position for observing Semenov's submarine when it surfaced. She had done it. 8 miles of open ocean, swimming through a storm that had tried to kill her, and she had reached her destination with hours to spare before the intercept window opened. Tessa pushed through the final distance on willpower alone, her body running on reserves she had not known she possessed. She reached the rocks and hauled herself onto a flat shelf just above the waterline, collapsing onto the stone with her chest heaving and her limbs trembling from exhaustion. She lay there for several minutes, letting the rising sun warm her frozen skin, feeling her heartbeat slowly return to normal. The mission was still possible. Semenov was still coming. She had no gear, no weapons, no support, but she was alive, and she was in position, and she was not going to let the men who had tried to murder her prevent her from doing what she had come here to do. The ocean had given her a gift. It had carried her exactly where she needed to be. Now she would use that gift to stop a monster and save the lives of the very people who had thrown her overboard. Tessa Rinaldi closed her eyes and let the sun restore what the sea had nearly taken. When Semenov surfaced, she would be ready. Tessa woke to the sound of a boat engine cutting through the morning stillness. She rolled onto her stomach and pressed herself flat against the rock, making her body as small as possible while her eyes scanned the water for the source of the noise. A fishing trawler was passing perhaps 300 yards to the north, its crew visible on deck as dark shapes moving through their morning routines. They showed no sign of having noticed her, their attention focused on nets and equipment rather than the rocky outcroppings that dotted this stretch of ocean. She waited until the trawler disappeared over the horizon before allowing herself to move. Her body protested every motion, muscles stiff and sore from the night's ordeal, but she forced herself through a series of stretches that would restore flexibility and blood flow. She could not afford to be sluggish when the time came to act. The sun climbed higher and warmth seeped back into her bones. She found a small pool of rainwater collected in a depression in the rock and drank deeply, the fresh water soothing her salt-ravaged throat. Her stomach growled with hunger, but food would have to wait. She had more pressing concerns than physical comfort. She took inventory of her situation with the cold pragmatism that had been drilled into her during years of training. No weapons, no communications equipment, no wetsuit or rebreather or propulsion device, no backup and no extraction plan. She was 8 miles from the Resolute, alone on a rock in hostile waters, with nothing but her training and her determination to complete a mission that had just become exponentially more difficult. The submarine would surface in approximately 6 hours. Semenov would transfer his cargo of biological weapons to the Yemeni militants and then disappear into the depths, beyond the reach of any conventional pursuit. If Tessa could not find a way to board that submarine and eliminate her target, everything she had endured would mean nothing. She needed to get back to the ship. The thought seemed absurd even as it formed in her mind. 8 miles of open water, no flotation assistance, no protection from the elements. She had barely survived the swim that brought her here, and that had been with the current working in her favor. Swimming back against that same current would be nearly impossible, even for someone with her training. But she had no other options. Her gear was still aboard the Resolute, hidden in the compartments that Crenshaw had failed to discover. Without that gear, she could not complete her mission. Without completing her mission, Viktor Semenov would continue selling weapons that killed innocent people around the world. Tessa slipped back into the water and began to swim. The current fought her every stroke, pushing against her progress with the indifferent persistence of a force that did not care whether she lived or died. She settled into a rhythm that maximized efficiency, knowing that speed was less important than endurance. She did not need to reach the ship quickly. She needed to reach it at all. Hours passed in a blur of physical effort and mental discipline. She counted strokes to keep her mind focused, breaking the impossible distance into manageable segments. 1,000 strokes, then rest. Another 1,000, then rest. The sun crossed the sky above her, its position telling her that time was running out, that Semenov's submarine would surface whether she was ready or not. She was perhaps 2 miles from the Resolute when she heard the helicopter. The aircraft appeared from the south, its rotors beating the air with a distinctive rhythm that Tessa recognized immediately. It was a naval helicopter, the same type that had delivered her to the ship days ago. It was flying a search pattern, sweeping back and forth across the water in a systematic grid that suggested someone was looking for something. Or someone. Tessa treaded water and watched the helicopter approach, her mind racing through possibilities. If Crenshaw had reported her death as an accident, there would be no search. The ship would continue its mission, and she would be written off as a civilian casualty of rough seas. But if someone had discovered the truth, if someone had found evidence of what really happened on that fantail, then everything changed. The helicopter passed directly overhead, and Tessa made a decision. She raised one arm out of the water and waved, the universal signal of a survivor seeking rescue. The aircraft banked hard and circled back, descending toward her position with a precision that spoke of experienced pilots responding to exactly the kind of emergency they had trained for. A rescue swimmer dropped from the helicopter and hit the water 20 feet from her position. He swam to her with powerful strokes and reached her in seconds, his face hidden behind goggles and a dive mask. He wrapped a flotation device around her torso and gave a thumbs up to the crew above, and then they were both rising toward the helicopter on the winch cable, lifted from the ocean that had been both her enemy and her ally for the past 12 hours. Master Chief Reyes was waiting in the helicopter bay. His face showed no surprise at finding her alive, only grim satisfaction that his suspicions had been correct. He wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders and leaned close so she could hear him over the roar of the rotors. Security cameras caught everything, he shouted. Captain Okonkwo has Crenshaw and his men in custody. The whole ship knows what they did. Tessa shook her head, water flying from her matted hair. The mission, she shouted back. Semenov surfaces in less than 4 hours. I need my gear. Reyes studied her for a long moment, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the iron determination that had carried her through the night. He nodded slowly. The captain is waiting for you, he said. We will get you what you need. The helicopter banked toward the Resolute, carrying Tessa back to the ship where men had tried to murder her and where her equipment waited in hidden compartments. She had 4 hours to recover her strength, retrieve her gear, and slip back into the ocean. 4 hours to prepare for the mission that would define her career. 4 hours before she came face to face with Viktor Semenov. The helicopter touched down on the Resolute's deck, and Tessa was moving before the rotors stopped spinning. Master Chief Reyes kept pace beside her as she strode through corridors that had been hostile territory just hours ago. Sailors stepped aside as she passed, their faces showing a mixture of shock and confusion at the sight of the drowned civilian, walking among them wrapped in nothing but a thermal blanket and her undergarments. Captain Okonkwo met her outside the briefing room, his expression carrying the weight of a commander who had nearly lost an asset to the criminal actions of men under his authority. He opened his mouth to speak, but Tessa cut him off before he could begin. I need my gear, and I need it now, she said. Semenov surfaces in less than 4 hours. Everything else can wait. The captain studied her for a moment, taking in the salt-crusted hair and the exhaustion lines carved into her face and the eyes that burned with a determination no amount of physical suffering could extinguish. He nodded once and gestured for her to follow. Your equipment is already being prepared, he said as they walked. Lieutenant Quigley has been monitoring communications all night. The intercept window is still valid. Semenov has no idea we know about the transfer. Tessa absorbed this information and felt some of the tension in her shoulders release. The mission was still viable. Everything she had endured had not been for nothing. They reached her quarters and Tessa found her equipment cases open on the cot, the hidden compartments exposed, and the gear laid out with the precision of someone who understood exactly what each piece was designed to do. Lieutenant Quigley stood beside the display, his tablet showing updated satellite imagery of the intercept coordinates. "I took the liberty of preparing everything," he said. "The rebreather has a full charge. The propulsion unit is operational. Your weapons have been inspected and loaded." Tessa moved to the gear and began checking each item with the methodical attention of someone whose life depended on every component functioning perfectly. The wet suit was intact. The combat knife her father had given her was sharp and balanced. The suppressed pistol held a full magazine with 2 spares ready. The specialized charges for disabling the submarine were armed and waiting. She stripped off the thermal blanket without modesty or hesitation, her body a tool that required preparation rather than protection. She pulled on the wetsuit and felt it seal around her like a second skin, the familiar pressure reminding her of every mission she had completed wearing this exact configuration of equipment. Captain Okonkwo cleared his throat. "There is something you should know before you deploy." Tessa looked up from strapping the knife to her thigh. "Crenshaw has been talking," the captain continued. "He claims he was trying to protect the ship from a foreign operative. He says he had no choice but to act when he discovered evidence of your deception. His men are backing his story." Tessa felt nothing at this news. Crenshaw's excuses were irrelevant to the mission at hand. He would face justice through proper channels, and whatever punishment awaited him would be determined by people far above her pay grade. Her only concern was Viktor Semenov and the weapons he was about to transfer to people who would use them to kill thousands. "Let him talk," she said. "It will not change what the cameras recorded." She finished gearing up and turned to Quigley. "Show me the latest intelligence." The lieutenant pulled up images on his tablet, satellite photographs showing the coordinates where Semenov's submarine would surface. The rocky outcroppings where Tessa had spent the morning were visible in the frame, and she felt a grim satisfaction at knowing she had navigated to exactly the right position despite swimming through a storm with nothing but stars to guide her. "There is a complication," Quigley said. His voice carried the hesitation of someone delivering news they knew would not be welcome. "We have detected additional radio traffic in the area. Encrypted communications that our analysts believe are connected to Semenov's network." "What kind of communications?" Tessa asked. Quigley enlarged a section of the satellite image, highlighting a cluster of small vessels positioned between the Resolute and the intercept coordinates. "The kind that suggests Semenov knows we are in the area. He may have sources aboard this ship or within naval intelligence. Either way, he is taking precautions." Tessa studied the image and felt the mission parameters shifting in her mind. Additional security meant additional obstacles. It also meant Semenov was nervous, which meant he might make mistakes. "It does not change anything," she said. "I will adapt." She moved toward the door, but stopped when Quigley spoke again. "My sister wanted to say something," he said quietly. "She wanted to thank you for doing this, for risking your life to stop the people who hurt her and so many others." Tessa met his eyes and saw the pain that lived there, the wound that had never fully healed. She understood that pain. She carried her own version of it, the grief for a father who had given everything to the ocean and received nothing in return. "Thank your sister when I get back," she said. "Tell her the people responsible will never hurt anyone again." She left the quarters and made her way to the deck, where Master Chief Reyes waited beside the rail with a look of professional respect on his weathered face. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of orange and gold that made the ocean look almost peaceful. For hours until Semenov surfaced. For hours until she would face the man whose weapons had caused suffering around the world. For hours until she would either complete her mission or die trying. Tessa checked her gear one final time and then slipped over the rail into the water below. The ocean welcomed her like an old friend, and she began to swim toward the intercept coordinates with steady, powerful strokes. Behind her, the Resolute continued on its course, carrying men who had tried to kill her and men who had saved her life. Ahead of her lay Viktor Semenov and the reckoning he had earned through decades of death. The water was where she belonged. and the water would carry her to her target. The submarine broke the surface at exactly 1700 hours, its black hull rising from the depths like a leviathan awakening from ancient sleep. Tessa watched from her position among the rocky outcroppings, her body submerged to the neck, and her rebreather ready to take her under at a moment's notice. She had arrived at the intercept coordinates 90 minutes ahead of schedule and had spent the time studying the water, memorizing currents, and calculating approach vectors. Semenov emerged from the conning tower within minutes of surfacing, his silhouette unmistakable against the evening sky. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders and thick through the chest, with a bald head that gleamed in the fading sunlight. He wore a heavy coat despite the mild temperature, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who trusted nothing and no one. A fishing vessel approached from the east, its engine cutting through the water with a rhythm that seemed too precise for a civilian craft. Tessa recognized the boat from the intelligence briefings. It was the transfer vessel, crewed by Yemeni militants who had paid millions for the biological agents sitting in the submarine's cargo hold. They would use those agents to kill civilians in markets and hospitals and schools, and they would do it with the cold efficiency of people who believe murder was a righteous act. The transfer began. Crates were hoisted from the submarine's deck to the fishing vessel, each one containing enough death to devastate a city. Tessa counted 6 crates in total, confirming the intelligence estimates. 6 packages of horror that would scatter across the Middle East and beyond if she failed to stop them. She was preparing to begin her approach when the Resolute appeared on the horizon. The destroyer emerged from the evening haze with its running lights visible and its course set directly toward the intercept coordinates. Tessa felt her stomach drop as she realized what was happening. The ship was responding to something, moving toward the submarine with a purpose that suggested either a rescue operation or an attack run. But the Resolute was not supposed to be here. The mission plan called for the destroyer to maintain its patrol route while Tessa handled the intercept alone. Something had gone wrong. Something had changed. The answer came seconds later when a burst of static erupted from the radio frequency she had been monitoring. An emergency distress signal, broadcasting on international channels, claiming that a vessel was sinking and requesting immediate assistance. The coordinates in the distress call were the exact location of Semenov's submarine. It was a trap. Tessa understood the full scope of the deception in an instant. Semenov had not been nervous about the Resolute's presence in the area. He had been counting on it. The distress signal was bait, designed to draw the American destroyer into a kill zone where the submarine and its escorts could engage without warning. This was not just an arms deal. This was an ambush meant to sink an American warship and blame it on Yemeni forces. The intelligence had been compromised. Someone had fed false information to Lieutenant Quigley, information designed to put the Resolute exactly where Semenov wanted it. And now 300 sailors were steaming toward their deaths, while Tessa floated helplessly among the rocks. She had seconds to make a choice. The original mission called for her to board the submarine, eliminate Semenov, and recover the weapons manifest. If she followed that plan, she might succeed in killing the arms dealer, but the Resolute would be destroyed before she could warn them. Crenshaw and his Marines would die. Master Chief Reyes would die. Lieutenant Quigley would die. Every sailor who had watched her walk their corridors as a civilian researcher would perish in an explosion that the world would blame on terrorism. Or she could abandon the assassination mission and try to save the ship. Tessa thought about her father in that moment. She thought about the nor'easter that had claimed his life and the choice he had made to save his crew instead of himself. She thought about the lesson he had taught her without ever speaking it aloud, that some things mattered more than personal objectives, that true courage meant sacrificing what you wanted for what others needed. She made her choice. Tessa activated her propulsion device and shot through the water toward the submarine, not to board it from a hidden angle, but to approach it directly. She surfaced beside the hull and grabbed the ladder leading to the deck, hauling herself up with strength born of desperation. Guards spotted her immediately and raised their weapons, but she was already moving, already pulling herself over the rail and sprinting toward the conning tower. Gunfire erupted around her. A bullet tore through the sleeve of her wetsuit, but missed the flesh beneath. Another ricocheted off the deck inches from her feet. She reached the conning tower hatch and dropped through it before the guards could adjust their aim, plunging into the red-lit interior of the submarine with her pistol drawn and her heart pounding against her ribs. Semenov was waiting in the control room, surrounded by crew members who looked more shocked than threatening. He stared at the dripping woman who had appeared from nowhere, his face showing the first genuine surprise he had experienced in decades. "Who are you?" he demanded in accented English. Tessa leveled her pistol at his chest. "I am the person who is going to stop you from killing 300 Americans. Call off your attack, or I will end you right here." Semenov smiled, and in that smile Tessa saw everything she needed to know about the kind of man she was facing. He reached into his coat and produced a small device, his thumb hovering over a button that glowed an angry red. "Too late," he said. "The torpedoes are already in the water." Tessa moved before conscious thought could slow her down. Her knife was in her hand, and then it was buried in the throat of the crew member nearest to the navigation console. She pulled the blade free and spun, catching a second man across the face with her elbow before he could raise his weapon. The control room erupted into chaos as Semenov's crew scrambled to respond to the violence that had exploded in their midst. Semenov lunged for the communications panel, but Tessa was faster. She kicked his legs out from under him and sent him crashing to the deck, the detonator skittering from his grip and sliding beneath the console. She could not reach it without exposing her back to the remaining crew, so she did the only thing that mattered. She took control of the submarine. The navigation officer died with a bullet through his skull. The weapons officer followed a second later. Tessa swept the control room with deadly efficiency, her training taking over completely as she eliminated every threat between herself and the helm. Bodies fell around her, men who had chosen to serve a monster and who paid the ultimate price for that choice. Semenov crawled toward the detonator, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead where he had struck the deck. Tessa kicked him in the ribs hard enough to flip him onto his back, then planted her boot on his chest and pressed the barrel of her pistol against his forehead. "The torpedoes," she said. "How do I stop them?" Semenov laughed, a wet and ugly sound that bubbled up from somewhere deep in his chest. "You cannot stop them. They are wire-guided. The moment they left the tubes, their course was locked. Your ship will be at the bottom of the ocean in less than 3 minutes." Tessa looked at the navigation console and saw the torpedo tracks on the sonar display. 2 weapons, running hot and straight toward the Resolute's position. The destroyer was attempting evasive maneuvers, but the torpedoes were too close and moving too fast. There was no time for countermeasures, no time for anything except watching 300 people die, unless she gave him something else to hit. She grabbed Semenov by the collar and hauled him to his feet, pressing the pistol into his spine as she forced him toward the helm. "You're going to dive this submarine directly into the path of those torpedoes." Semenov went rigid. "That is suicide. The warheads will tear us apart." Tessa shoved him forward. "Then we die together. But my people live." She forced him to the helm and made him input the commands, watching over his shoulder to ensure he was not attempting to deceive her. The submarine lurched as its ballast tanks flooded, the deck tilting forward as the vessel began its emergency dive. Through the periscope display, Tessa watched the Resolute growing larger on the horizon, the torpedoes visible as white streaks cutting through the water toward her ship. The submarine dropped beneath the surface and accelerated, its engines screaming as Tessa pushed them beyond their design limits. She calculated angles and distances in her head, adjusting course to intercept the torpedo tracks. The mathematics were simple. The execution was anything but. Semenov tried to break free when he realized she was serious. He threw an elbow at her face and twisted away from her grip, lunging for a sidearm mounted on the bulkhead. Tessa shot him twice in the chest before he could reach it. He collapsed against the wall, his eyes wide with disbelief as blood spread across his expensive coat. "You are insane," he gasped. "You will die for nothing." Tessa stepped over his body and took the helm herself. "Not for nothing," she said. "For them." The first torpedo struck the submarine's bow with an impact that threw Tessa off her feet. The hull screamed as metal twisted and tore, water rushing through breaches that opened like wounds in the vessel's skin. Alarms shrieked and emergency lights flickered, painting the control room in strobing red. The second torpedo hit amidships, and the world dissolved into chaos. Tessa was thrown against the bulkhead as the submarine broke apart around her. Water flooded the control room, rising with terrifying speed as the vessel began its final descent. She fought through the torrent, searching for the weapons manifest that Quigley needed to dismantle Semenov's network. She found it in a waterproof case strapped to the navigation console, exactly where intelligence had predicted it would be. She grabbed the case and made for the nearest hatch, forcing it open against the pressure of incoming water. The submarine was sinking fast, sections breaking away as it plummeted toward the ocean floor. Tessa swam through corridors that were rapidly filling with seawater, her rebreather providing the oxygen she needed to survive the impossible journey. She found a torpedo tube that had been blown open by the explosions and squeezed through it, emerging into open water as the submarine disappeared into the darkness below. She kicked toward the surface with the weapons manifest clutched to her chest, her lungs burning despite the rebreather, her muscles screaming after everything she had already endured. She broke the surface and gasped clean air, her eyes immediately searching for the Resolute. The destroyer was still afloat, still intact, its crew scrambling to understand what had just happened. The torpedoes that should have sunk it had detonated against a submarine that was never supposed to be in their path. Tessa activated her emergency beacon and began treading water. She had killed Viktor Semenov. She had saved the Resolute. She had recovered the weapons manifest. And she was still alive. The ocean had tried to claim her twice in 24 hours. Both times, she had refused to let it win. Master Chief Reyes pulled her from the water for the second time in 12 hours. His hands gripped her forearms with a strength that spoke of desperate relief, hauling her over the gunwale of the rescue boat and laying her on the deck as gently as if she were made of glass. She still clutched the waterproof case containing the weapons manifest, her fingers locked around the handle with a grip that would not release even when he tried to pry it free. "Easy," he said. "You're safe now. Let go." Tessa opened her eyes and looked up at the sky, watching the first stars appear in the deepening twilight. She was alive. Against every odd and every obstacle, she was alive. She released the case and let her arms fall to her sides, her chest heaving with breaths that felt like the first she had ever taken. The rescue boat carried her back to the Resolute, where a crowd had gathered at the rail to watch her approach. Word had spread through the ship with the speed of wildfire. The civilian researcher they had mocked and harassed was not a civilian at all. She was a Navy SEAL who had just sunk an enemy submarine with her bare hands to save their lives. Captain Okonkwo was waiting at the boarding ladder. He extended his hand to help her aboard, and when she took it, he pulled her into an embrace that violated every protocol of military formality. She felt his shoulders shake with emotion he could not quite contain, and she understood that he had spent the last hour believing his ship and his crew were about to die. "Lieutenant Commander Rinaldi," he said when he finally released her. His voice was thick but steady. "On behalf of every soul aboard this vessel, thank you." Tessa nodded, too exhausted for words. She let the medical team guide her toward the infirmary, walking through a corridor lined with sailors who watched her pass in stunned silence. Some of them had laughed when Holt drove her from the mess hall. Some of them had looked away when her equipment was sabotaged. Now they stood at attention as she passed, offering the respect they had denied her when they thought she was nothing more than an inconvenient civilian. The infirmary was quiet and cool, a sanctuary of white sheets and antiseptic calm. Tessa lay on a bed while corpsmen checked her vital signs and treated the cuts and bruises that covered her body. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind processing the events of the past 24 hours in fragments that did not quite fit together. She woke to find Lance Corporal Yuki Brennan standing at the foot of her bed. The young Marine looked uncomfortable, her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes fixed on the deck. She did not speak for a long moment, and when she finally found words, they came out barely above a whisper. "I should have said something," Brennan said, "when they were harassing you, when they drove you out of the mess. I saw what was happening, and I did nothing because I was afraid of what Crenshaw would do to me if I spoke up." Tessa pushed herself into a sitting position, wincing at the protest from her battered muscles. She studied the young woman and saw the guilt written in every line of her face. "You're speaking now," Tessa said. "That matters." Brennan looked up, surprise flickering across her features. "I am a coward. I let them treat you like garbage because I did not want to become a target myself." Tessa considered this for a moment before responding. "The ocean teaches you something about courage," she said. "It teaches you that being brave does not mean being unafraid. It means acting despite your fear. You were afraid, and you did not act. But you are here now, which means you are ready to make a different choice next time." Brennan blinked rapidly, fighting back tears she clearly did not want to shed. "How do I become like you?" she asked. "How do I find that kind of strength?" Tessa smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since boarding the Resolute. "You already have it. You just have not been pushed hard enough to discover it yet. When that push comes, and it will, remember this moment. Remember that you have already decided to be better than you were." Brennan nodded and straightened to attention, offering a salute that Tessa returned from her hospital bed. The young Marine left without another word, but something in her posture had changed. She walked taller, her shoulders squared against whatever challenges awaited her. Captain Okonkwo appeared an hour later with Lieutenant Quigley at his side. The intelligence officer looked like a man who had been given a gift he never expected to receive. He held the waterproof case containing the weapon's manifest, his fingers tracing its edges with something approaching reverence. "The manifest is intact," he said. "Names, dates, financial records, delivery schedules. Everything we need to dismantle Semenov's entire network. This will save thousands of lives." Tessa nodded, feeling a weight lift from her chest. She had accomplished her mission. Viktor Semenov was dead at the bottom of the ocean, and the evidence that would destroy his legacy was safe in American hands. "And Crenshaw?" she asked. Captain Okonkwo's expression hardened. "Gunnery Sergeant Crenshaw and Corporal Holt are in custody pending court-martial. The security footage is unambiguous. They will face charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and conduct unbecoming. Their careers are over, and they will spend years in military prison." Tessa absorbed this without satisfaction. Crenshaw's fate brought her no joy. He was a small man who had made small choices, and now he would pay the price for them. She had larger concerns than revenge. The Resolute continued its patrol, carrying her back toward port and the debriefings that awaited. Tessa spent the journey recovering her strength and writing her after-action report, documenting every detail of the mission for the intelligence analysts who would build cases against Semenov's surviving associates. On the final evening before they reached port, she stood alone on the fantail where Crenshaw's men had thrown her overboard. The water stretched to the horizon in every direction, calm and dark beneath the canopy of stars. She thought about her father and the lessons he had taught her. She thought about the ocean that had shaped her into the woman she had become. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about your favorite moment or character, or tell us about someone you know who showed hidden strength when everyone else counted them out. The water had tried to kill her. Instead, it had carried her to victory. Tessa Rinaldi smiled at the horizon and let the sea breeze wash over her face, at peace with the element that would always be her home.